Welcome to the Steady On podcast, where God's hard truth meets your hard story. I don't need to tell you that life gets hard. Life gets hard, really hard. But God's faithfulness is still active and alive in our hard. And these episodes are dedicated to remembering and claiming the promises of a faithful God. I'm your host, Angie Bauman. I'm a pastor and Bible teacher, founder of Steady On Ministries, and creator of the Step-by-Step Bible Study Method. But more than that, I'm a trauma and abuse survivor who carried a heavy weight of shame and worthlessness for many years. And I still struggle, but I live in much more freedom now because I know God through His Word and speak truth to the lies of the enemy with His Word. And that's what we do here. On Mondays, we take it in by studying the promises of God. And on Wednesdays, we live it out with teaching and testimony on the promises of God. So thank you for tuning in, my friend. You are the reason for this show. And I'm so very, very glad you are here. Let's get started. Hello and welcome in today. I'm sharing a conversation with you about a subject that touches every one of us, grief. And my guest today is grief minister Julie Lynn Ashley. Julie holds a master's degree in Thanatology. I had to look that up, and I hope I'm saying it right. It is the study of death and grief and bereavement, and you'll hear her talk more about Thanatology in the interview. Julie pursued this education in part because as a pastor's wife, she interacts with many people who are grieving, and she also experiences how poorly most of us navigate grief and walk with others who are grieving. Our verse today is Isaiah 61:1. Hear it in the voice. The Spirit of the Lord, the Eternal, is on me. The Lord has appointed me for a special purpose. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to repair broken hearts and to declare to those who are held captive and bound in prison, be free from your imprisonment. If you've ever grieved or walked alongside someone else who was grieving, hello everyone, then I think you'll be informed and encouraged in what Julie shares today. Let's listen in. Julie Lynn, welcome to the Steady On community. I am so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me this morning, Angie. I am already loving talking with you.
This is going to be great. And we're going to talk about grief. As I said in the intro, we're going to talk about grief, but we talk about a lot of hard stories here, Julie Lynn, but we are doing it with an extra dose of hope today, right? Because there is hope in grief. There are resources to be had as you're struggling. And so we just want this to be a conversation where you feel seen and encouraged. And so I know you have a master's degree in Thanatology. Am I even saying that right? Is that the right way to say it?
Yes, you are. You got it exactly right.
Before I received information on what you do and what you could talk about here, I didn't even know this was something that existed. So tell us, what is Thanatology, and how did God lead you into this study and this kind of work that you're doing?
So the Greek word for death is Thanos. Any of my Avengers fans out there have probably heard that name, as he is the main villain with that whole movie series. And so with the Greek word for death being Thanos, the study of grief, death, bereavement from a lot of different angles is Thanatology. There are a number of schools across the U.S. that offer a master's degree or a certificate in this line of study. And I went for the master's degree, which in so many of our stories, we can smile and say that was something that I had said I would absolutely never do, is go back to school. And how this all unfolded, my husband is a pastor, a lead pastor here in Texas. And so we had gotten a ministry call to come to Texas. And this was a number of years ago. And when you move to a new town, you're looking for, how can I connect in the community? And how can I meet new people and make new friends? Because I'm starting all over again. And so a local acquaintance of mine had said, hey, Julie Lynn, you should come and volunteer at this hospice that's in town where I work. And I thought, well, I've never done that before, but this is a new day and a new chapter. And so why not just go give it a try? And when I got in there, it was this instant line that God drew from my heart to grieving people, specifically after a death loss. And so I worked with this hospice, volunteering with them. And it was one of the chaplains there that told me about Thanatology and that there were graduate programs that I could pursue. And so that was the windy road that God used to introduce this to me. And I had never loved studying something so much. I was never so motivated to do the papers and all the things there had been 22 years that had gone by since I had been in school. And so I hope that encourages any of the listeners out there that God might throw something at you that you say, oh, there's no way I can do that. And I can tell you that God provided for every step, every paper, everything that was required to complete this and to continue on this passion he had put in my heart that I had no idea. I was just going to volunteer. I had no idea all of this was going to unfold.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I echo that. It's not that there's not obstacles to be overcome when God calls us on a certain path. And I'm sure you had some obstacles that you faced along the way, but there is something that happens when I'm just like, oh, this is a door that has just opened in an unexplainable way, right? Somehow the dots are connecting. And it's not easy necessarily, but it makes sense. It's peaceful. It makes sense. I understand the next step to take. And I'm like, oh, that's where God is at work. God is at work there in my life. And so I need to be paying attention to that. So for sure, I appreciate that. Let me ask this. Is there something in your past that you want to talk about? And if you don't, that's okay, that like made your heart sort of extra sensitive to these grieving people? Do you share any of your story that why you're like, oh yeah, this is why I'm so passionate about helping people in this hard spot?
Yes, there's two main big kind of pinpoints I can look back if you were to look at a timeline of my life. One of them started as early as 39 years ago in the 6th grade. I discovered the story of, it's written by the sports writer Frank DeFord, and he tells the story of losing his young daughter, Alex, to cystic fibrosis. And I did a school report on this years ago and was just captivated as a 6th grader by this story of grief, both the anticipatory grief he was experiencing in watching his daughter lose her fight with cystic fibrosis, and then the grief afterward. And then fast forward years later, I lost a friend in my college years to murder. And that was a complete shock as a young person. This was a random event. It was not premeditated. And she was no longer on campus at the time. She had already graduated. But as a young person, you just don't imagine losing somebody that suddenly and that violently. And that was another place that God had me walk through this valley of grief and all the things that I experienced that would plant seeds for later in my life where I would have some degree of understanding of what this feels like, the shock and the fear and so many emotions that happen after you lose someone that you care about. So God planted some of those seeds. And then of course, in my pastor's wife life, in interacting with grief and funerals and those types of things, in that role as a pastor's wife too. So God used so many different experiences to plant these seeds and then bring it to fruition so many years later. And that's the part, again, in talking with your audience, is that you just don't know what God's going to do with some of these seeds that were planted so long ago, and how he takes those things and weaves them together into this beautiful adventure you never expected. I never expected this, especially once my kids were in high school, to be going back to school myself. So that it's just been an amazing journey. I can't say enough good things about it. And you were right. There are some hard moments and some tough assignments that I had to do, but it was worth all of it to get to help grieving people now.
Yeah. Thank you for letting us in just on a couple of those like spiritual markers. I call those things where you look back and you're like, oh, I see that my heart was softened, tenderized, something, during that experience that has made me be able to want to do this work and to serve other people in this way. Like I went through something, I was missing something. I wish I had known this. Some of those things are the greatest motivators for us to hear his call to partner with him in kingdom work, which is what I see that you're doing right now. One of the goals of why I do this show is to help those of us who are struggling with anything fight that temptation that we're alone. I think that's one of the enemy's greatest weapons, if you will, like I will isolate. We're more vulnerable when we feel isolated, right? And so if he tells us, no one's ever felt this way before, or no one's ever done this thing as bad as you've done, whatever, to make us feel alone. So just in your work with grief, help us, those of us who are grieving, feel less alone, if you will, please, by just kind of like maybe normalizing it, or telling us some of the common things that we experience, anything like that just reminds us that not only is Jesus with us always, but also we are not unusual because we've gone through something and we're really grieving it.
Yes. We're going to put this in the show notes, but I know one of your guests is Lisa Appelo, who is a grief author. And I recently wrote a blog post for her that we'll put in the show notes that talks about 3 kind of key times to follow up with a grieving person. Even though the grief is going to be just as individual as the person's fingerprint that was lost, God only made one of that person. We do see some similarities in some certain time frames with grieving people. So one of those right out of the gate is the 4 to 6 week mark after a loss. The person who's grieving is often in a bit of a brain fog. This is the body's natural anesthesia, getting this person used to the loss, and that the fact that this person is physically not here anymore. And so at the 4 to 6 week mark, when I worked at the hospice, that's a time that the hospice would have us call and check on a grieving person. And part of the process behind that is you've got someone who's in a brain fog that is also juggling a tidal wave of administrative duties. So they're dealing with having to go get the death certificate and explaining to so many people that the person that they cared about has died. So that's a key time if you are trying to help a grieving person. 4 to 6 weeks after the loss, generally the cards, the flowers, the casseroles are all gone, and they are dealing with a brain fog and a tidal wave of administrative duties. So you can imagine what a meal or a text or some type of reach out during that time frame would be incredibly helpful. So that's one key time. The second key time I talk about, which is another time that we followed up as a hospice worker, was 6 months. And the reason why is because at 6 months, typically that brain fog that they've been experiencing has worn off. And they are dealing with that raw pain of the permanence of this loss. This person is not on a vacation. They're not on a trip. They are not coming home. And that can be really difficult for somebody. And so that 6 months after a loss is another key time to just call, check, take a meal, and check on somebody. And then lastly, 11 months is another key time. And I've heard this from grieving people themselves. And the reason why is 11 months after a loss, right before that year anniversary, they are remembering all of the last things that they experienced with that person that they loved. And so that can be a very tender time. In some cases, from what I've heard from grieving people, it can be even worse than the year anniversary of the death itself. Beyond that, I've talked with widows that have said year 2 was far worse than year 1. So there's no timetable and no calendar for this, but these are just some markers of when it would be a strategic time to follow up with somebody that's grieving. And some of that is based on, like I said, some of the training that I had in the hospice too, and why they follow up with grieving people during those times. Another key thing to remember is anything that is going to come on the other side of these 2 words, at least, is not going to help a grieving person. That is, when you use those words, that's to comfort yourself, not to comfort a grieving person. So when you use the words at least, it minimizes their loss. It does not lift it up or esteem it. And so that is another key thing to remember when you are trying to walk with someone who is grieving, is that it's going to be, for those of you that are musical out there, it's going to be, in essence, a dissonant chord. A chord that has not resolved and does not sound pretty. And it takes great courage to walk with somebody who it's not going to be fixed. and it's not going to resolve itself quickly. That's not how grief works. So those are just some key things to remember to help a grieving person feel less alone. And just some practical things to be thinking about as you're walking with grieving people in your life.
And I think whether we are the grieving person, or thank you for all that, or helping the grieving person also to understand, like, this brain fog that I'm experiencing is normal. This is a part of the grieving fit. Like, other people will go through this, right? Or this lifting, or this 11-month that just feels like it's been a while now. Why is it so hard again? I really appreciate that, because it just invites us in. And I love what you're saying about the at least, because I think as people of faith, we need to do our part to have language to prepare for what we are and are not going to say when someone we care about is hurting, right? And I think the at leasts and other trite and Christianese things that we say sometimes, what that really does is it tries to build a barrier between us and their hurt, right? I mean, I don't think we mean to do it. I think it's like self-protection almost, but are we willing to say, I don't know what to say? Are we willing to say, I wish I had something to say, but I don't? Are we willing to say, I can't fix this, but I'll sit here with you? Or, can't, because that opens us up to the vulnerability as well. And I think that shows a deeper level of acknowledgement. And I don't know, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. One of the things that I think we're afraid of is like bringing it up, whatever it is in the person's life, because we don't want them to get emotional. But something that I've heard from people that I've walked through who are deeply grieving is it feels like nobody wants me to talk about her, or it feels like nobody wants me to talk about it, or whatever. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because I have experienced in my work, I guess, or my pastoral work, is that actually when I run into somebody in the grocery store, instead of talking about everything, but like to actually say, how are you? And invite them to talk about it, seems like even if they are emotional, it seems to them like it actually is a really wonderful thing for you to create space where they can share their memory. I don't know. You can disagree with me if you want. That's just what do you have to say about that kind of?
That is spot on, Angie.
Okay.
And it is very congruent with one of the resources that we're going to link in the show notes.
Excellent.
It's a YouTube video by Nancy Guthrie. This is a faith-based video that she's done. It's 20 minutes long. And it's called What Grieving People Wish You Knew About What Really Helps and What Really Hurts.
Oh.
Nancy is one of the co-hosts of Grief Share. She has lost 2 children. So you can imagine she absolutely has the right to be heard with what she's saying in this video. This is a video I use with a lot of my clients, and it's a video I use when I do workshops for church staff. So we're going to link that in the show notes. So any of you this is applicable to anybody, but especially if you're a ministry leader out there, this would be a great resource to take to your church staff. And she says almost verbatim what you just said. She said, so many times we worry that what if I, quote, make them cry if I bring up the loss? And she said, you can't make them cry. She said, those tears were already in there. And when you bring it up, you offer them the chance to release some of what was already there. They haven't forgotten that they lost someone this close to them and that you reminded them. That's not how this works. And she said, what an incredible gift to make space, like you said, when you run into somebody at the grocery store, or not to pretend that their person wasn't alive. And it's not like they have stopped loving them. So, and it's just a gift to bring it up. And she'll talk about that in this video. Yeah. She describes grief as, she said, it's almost like this computer program that's open in the back of someone's mind all the time. Yes. It never shuts down.
Yes.
And so it's a gift to acknowledge that, but it takes courage because it's countercultural. Yes. In Western society, we avoid talking about grief or loss or sad things. And so it's countercultural to bring it up. And that's a brave thing to do. And it's so needed.
I'm so glad, because I'm so glad that you're able to affirm that. I would totally been able to hear it if you were, but I'm like, I feel like in this and other people have said that to me, where it just feels like nobody wants me to talk about them. Right.
Right.
And I think we feel like we've done it wrong if they cry. But in reality, you think about how many times throughout the day that person isn't mentioned in their interactions or something, or if people are kind of tippy-toeing around it, and it just feels, I think that makes them feel less alone or less seen, and that we're not honoring the grief. Right.
Right.
Yeah. There's a difference between honoring it and like helping someone stay stuck or whatever. But but to honor that. So thank you for that. I appreciate that encouragement. And yes, we will link all of these resources that Julie Lynn keeps mentioning for sure. Yes. So I know that you, as you said, as a pastor's wife, you interact with a lot of people in your faith communities that are grieving, because this touches all of us. So talk to us about those of us who are in faith communities. We're not talking about it. You gave me something shocking before we pressed record, that in most Masters of Divinity, most seminary educations, most clinical practitioners, I can't remember what you said, but there's not a study, there's not a class on grief. We're not teaching this to our leaders. And so therefore, I think that helps us not talk about it in our faith communities. So give us some help there. How can we be helpful in our churches?
So I'm going to tell you what we've done in our church here in Texas. And one key thing, it's so simple, but I tell this to most ministry leaders that I interact with, that I talk about grief with, is those funeral programs. We've all seen them, that have the person's picture and the dates of their life, at those paper programs that they give you at a funeral. Do not throw those away. That is the key that begins your follow-up. And here's why: because inside that funeral program, you know their wedding anniversary, you know their birthday, you know days that you can plug in your phone to send them a text, to check on them. And so that funeral program is a treasure trove of follow-up. Don't throw that in the trash. And what our church has done with those is created just a really simple Excel spreadsheet. And so my husband is now writing notes to people on those key dates. And everybody grieves differently. There's no one right or wrong way to grieve, but the feedback he's had from those has been like nothing he's ever seen before. Someone that will come up to him in the church lobby and say, "Thank you for reaching out to me on my wedding anniversary without my husband, and how difficult that day was. And that I got a note from you," when sometimes people's extended families have forgotten. So this doesn't necessarily need to stay with just church staff. It could go to a small group leader, because we already know a lot of the church staff have tons and tons of things on their plate. So this could go to a small group leader, and obviously it can happen within friendships too, but just not to throw out those funeral programs. And that's some of what we've done in a small way to try to support grieving people at our church. And the response has been very positive.
I love that. As you're talking, I think about, even like, if you're somebody who's listening is feeling a Holy Spirit stirring to say, I can do more for the grieving people in my circle, in my church, and whatever. And I just imagine this like either paper or Google Calendar or something. You bring that funeral, you went, or you got the obituary online or something, and you have that wonderful information. Wow, that's brilliant. But you set up this calendar and you set up reminders or something, and you just say, I want to be intentional about this. And so I'm going to take this information and plug it in somewhere that I'll see it when it's time. And then I can reach out with a note or a call or a text or whatever the relationship deems, and just say, I'm still thinking and praying about you. Because that, when the casseroles are gone and all of that you said at the beginning, that all that kind of activity dies down, but the grief, and really, because the busyness, I think that's when the grief really settles in, the permanence of it settles in. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And that is such, when you think about the story in the Bible, back in Genesis with Hagar, and when she refers to God as, you are the God who sees me. And this is a touch of that. When you send a text on that really tender day for a grieving person, it's this realization, God sees me. God's using someone, in my faith family to communicate with, like, God sees me. He hasn't forgotten me. And so to be the hands and feet of Christ in this matter is just, there's not even words. It's a tender, raw place and we've seen through the Bible, God cares about the brokenhearted. And so to reach into those places is just, it's a huge privilege. It can be intimidating, but it's a big privilege.
We've scattered some resources throughout as we're kind of wrapping up We're going to link, friend, just a ton of. Julie Lynn has been so gracious, and even ahead of time, she sent me links to the video that she referred to, the blog post she referred to. I would say probably half a dozen other websites and different things that has quality resources. Anything you want to say about those other than just they'll be in the show notes?
They will be in the show notes. There'll be a link to my website that has a lot of these listed as grief resources. I'm just going to touch on 2 or 3 of them right now, just to explain kind of where we're going with this. One of my favorite ones that I heard about in grad school is a organization called mollybears.org. And they will recreate a teddy bear in the exact birth weight of a baby that died, and send it. I have used this as a trusted resource with some of my clients. And so I know it works. I have seen bears that have come, and what a comfort that has been to grieving parents that want to feel that weight in their arms. And then another couple that are across the country where you can plug in your zip code and find a group meeting near you is compassionatefriends.org for people that have lost children. Griefshare.org is another one where you can put in your zip code and find a grief support group near you. And then one of my favorite new ones, and we'll wrap up with this, is neveralonewidows.com. They're a faith-based organization that does free retreats for widows all over the country, and specifically widows that have children that are ages 5 and under. They also have a whole military branch that does work with widows from our first responders. And so just an incredible resource there, podcasts and grief resources and all these different things available to you. So check them out. They'll be linked in the show notes as well. But those are just a handful of some of the ones that I'm researching all the time to get more grief resources in the hands of ministry leaders. So there's, you can also contact me over my website. I have a newsletter I send out once a month with one of these grief resources in it every single month. Just to get another resource in your hands as you're working with people, not only in your life, but if you're a ministry leader, people in your church as well.
This has been a really, I just feel like this has been a really important conversation that is just really full of resources and help for those of us who are grieving, for those of us who are walking alongside someone who is grieving. And friend, if that's not really hitting where you are right now, it will impact you. And so this is a really wonderful time to know where these resources are and to learn a little bit about when I have a friend that goes through something like this, to already have something in your toolbox to be able to say, not that we want this to come, but it will come, right? And so how are we helping ourselves be the kind of people that can reach out a hand and not just wait for it to get better, So right. I really, really just appreciate your story, your work, your resources. And again, Julie Lynn is at julielynashley.com. And there are a ton of resources in today's show notes. And we are so grateful for your time today and for the fact that you're willing to serve us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I really enjoyed it.
It's fantastic. And thank you, friend, for listening. Until next time, peace.
I've done a lot of interviews for this show, but as I look back over them, I think for me, this conversation holds some of the most universal, practical help I've recorded. I'm grateful for Julie, the passion God has given her to help others as they grieve, and for her willingness to share with us today. Our verse again this week is Isaiah 61:1. Hear it in the NIV translation. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. If you haven't yet, I hope you'll listen to Monday's Take It In episode where I focus on the word bind. Next week, our Take It In verse will be James 1:20 that reminds us human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. And my guest will be the incredibly brave Natalie Hickson. Natalie sat down with me to talk about anger, a family cycle of abuse, and how God used an unexpected conversation to invite Natalie to break old habits and develop new responses. It's a fabulous conversation you won't want to miss. If you haven't yet, I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe or follow the podcast on whatever directory you're using to listen. It only takes a second and it guarantees you'll see new episodes as soon as they drop. And if someone came to mind as you were listening today, I'd love it if you would share this episode with them. Inviting them into what we're doing here is another great way to support the show. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.